May 1944. The southern edge of the Texas grain belt stretches from horizon to horizon with millions of acres of wheat going gold in the heat. It should be loud with men and machinery, but it isn't. The young men who work these fields every summer are loading onto ships in the Pacific or waiting in England for a landing they cannot talk about. The wheat is ready. The workers are gone. Then, out of the shimmering distance, a sound. Engines. A column of wagon-red machines crests the hill, guided by airplanes circling overhead. How did a rationed wartime home front turn a civilian harvest into a mechanized military blitzkrieg? The pre-war planes and the threshing ring. To see why that mechanical column was so extraordinary, you have to look back a generation, to a time before the war when the Great Plains harvest looked nothing like this. Through the 1930s, many plains farmers still cut their wheat with a binder, pulled by horses or tractors that sliced the stalks and tied them into bundles. Those bundles got stacked by hand into shocks in the field, and then the waiting started. You waited for the threshing outfit to arrive, because the threshing outfit was the whole event. A steam engine, or later a tractor, sat in the field powering a massive separator through a long flat belt. Horse-drawn wagons hauled bundles in from the shocks. Grain blew up into a wagon or a bin, straw piled up in a mountain behind the machine. And feeding all of it, pitching bundles up onto the wagons and into the separator's throat, were 15 to 20 men working in the dust and the July heat. These crews didn't come from nowhere, they came from the neighborhood. Farmers pooled their labor in what everyone called a threshing ring. You helped your neighbor thresh his wheat, and he came back with his team and his sons when it was your turn. Some operations hired professional custom threshing outfits that traveled the county with their own machines and crews. But even those ran on the same basic formula: a lot of men, a stationary machine, and weeks of coordinated scheduling to work through a whole community's crop. There was a rhythm to it that people actually loved. The long tables of food the women put out at noon, the specific social order of who drove, who pitched, who handled the grain, kids growing up watching their fathers and uncles work in the heat together. Agricultural historians have written about the threshing ring almost the way people write about barn raisings, as one of those rare moments where rural isolation gave way to something that felt like a village. But that romance had a structural flaw nobody wanted to talk about. The whole system assumed that a dozen able-bodied men would show up and do their share, season after season. It had never needed to be flexible because it had never been tested. Pull-type combines, the kind a tractor dragged through the field, had been around since the early 20th century. By 1926, a United States Department of Agriculture study found that roughly 30% of the Kansas wheat crop was already being harvested by combine. So the technology existed. Farmers knew it worked. Some of the bigger operations had already moved on. But in much of the plains, the harvest still ran on the threshing ring through the 1930s. Partly it was economics. A thresher that the whole neighborhood shared cost less than a combine you bought alone. Partly it was inertia. Partly it was that the ring was embedded in how people understood their relationship with each other and with the land. Global war changed the math on everything, and the threshing ring was not going to survive the arithmetic. But the missing labor was only half the problem. The other half was something far more specific, a bottleneck buried inside the machinery itself that Washington had not identified yet, and that was quietly turning a harvest shortage into a potential national security crisis. Understanding it required looking at exactly what kind of machine was already available, and why it was not enough. The impossible mandate of 1942. By 1942, the United States was trying to do two things at the same time that had no business being done at the same time: feed the world and fight a war. The Allied war machine ran on food as much as it ran on fuel. Soldiers in the Pacific needed calories. Britain had been rationing since 1940 and was running short on grain imports. The Soviet Union was fighting on a front that stretched 2,000 miles and losing farmland to the German advance every month. Someone had to make up the difference, and that someone was the American wheat farmer. The War Food Administration made the demand explicit. It called for 13.8 million more acres of wheat than the previous year, and total seeded wheat area reached about 67 million acres in 1944, up from roughly 55 million acres in 1943. On paper, those numbers looked like a triumph of national mobilization. Out in the fields, they looked like a catastrophe waiting to happen. Because the same war that was calling for a record harvest was also stripping the farms bare of everything needed to bring one in. The young men were the most obvious loss. Enlistments and the draft pulled farm labor off the plains in waves starting in 1942. The hired hands who used to fill out a threshing crew, the older boys who drove wagons and pitched bundles, the mechanics who kept aging equipment running through another season, were in uniform now, and there was no replacing them at scale. But the labor shortage was only part of it. Steel was rationed, rubber was rationed, gasoline was rationed, and the factories that used to stamp out cultivators and combine headers had been retooled for tanks and aircraft components. Massey-Harris itself was building M5 Stuart light tanks alongside its farm equipment. Every pound of steel that went into a combine chassis was a pound that was not going into armor plate, and Washington had strong opinions about that trade-off. The result was that the farm equipment available in 1944 was mostly whatever had been built before the war. Machines that were already tired from the brutal work of the 1930s drought years, already stretched through several seasons without proper parts or maintenance, now faced the biggest wheat crop in American history. The USDA's July 1944 report put the expected harvest at 1.128 billion bushels, the largest the country had ever produced. And the question of who was going to cut it, with what machines running on rationed fuel, was not a question anyone had a clean answer to. The War Production Board controlled civilian manufacturing through a strict quota system. For 1944, Massey-Harris was authorized to produce 43,604 pull-type combines and just 1,100 self-propelled units. Other manufacturers faced similar caps. When implement makers lobbied for more steel to meet the harvest emergency, the board's answer was essentially the same every time: there is no steel to spare. Nobody was wrong exactly. The military really did need the steel. The harvest really was in trouble. Those two facts just sat on opposite sides of a scale, and the scale was not moving. What the situation needed was not more raw material. It needed someone who could prove that the material already allocated could do more work than anyone thought possible, and do it in a way that Washington's arithmetic could not argue with. That person existed. He worked for Massey-Harris, and he had a plan that was less a farming proposal than a military campaign. The machine that changed everything. Massey-Harris had been working on the answer to this problem for more than a decade before the war made it urgent. The company was one of the biggest farm machinery makers in North America by the 1930s, headquartered in Toronto but with major production plants in Racine, Wisconsin. Their engineers spent that decade chasing a specific idea: a combine that did not need a tractor. One machine, one operator, one pass through the field, and the grain was in the tank. No second engine idling somewhere behind it. No second man sitting on a tractor seat. Just the combine moving under its own power. In 1938, they thought they had it. The Model 20 self-propelled combine rolled out of the factory big and capable, and it worked. But it was heavy. It was expensive. For the average plains farmer running a few hundred acres, it was more machine than the economics could justify. The big operations bought them, Most farmers did not. So the engineers went back at it, and around 1941 they introduced the Model 21. That machine was a different proposition entirely. The engine on the Model 21 was not mounted up high on a conventional frame the way you might expect. It sat underneath the grain tank, lower and further back, which dropped the center of gravity and gave the whole machine a balance that made it stable in rough field conditions. The header, the wide cutting bar across the front, ran 12 feet across, broad enough to take a serious bite out of a wheat field with every pass. And it ran on one person. One operator in the seat managed the cutting, the threshing, the grain handling, and the machine's movement through the field all at once. That last point matters more than it might sound. A tractor-pulled combine required a tractor driver and a combine operator, at minimum. 2 men, 2 machines, burning fuel in both engines simultaneously. The Model 21 cut that equation in half. There was another advantage that Tucker would later quantify for Washington in hard numbers. When a tractor pulled a combine into a field to start a run, the tractor had to drive over uncut grain to get into position, crushing a strip of standing wheat with every tire. On a big operation, running dozens of fields all season, that added up to real losses. A self-propelled combine drove itself into position from the cut portion of the field. The grain it would have crushed stayed standing and got harvested instead. Tucker's estimate put that saved grain at around 500,000 bushels across the brigade's planned season, saved grain that would otherwise have been ground into the dirt under tractor tires. The Model 21 could also move between fields under its own power. A tractor-pulled combine had to be loaded onto a trailer or driven down roads at low speed with the tractor in tow. The Model 21 just drove itself there. For custom operators planning to work dozens of farms across a county, that mobility was worth something real in hours saved every week. By 1943, it was clear this machine was ready to do exactly what the war needed. Fast, fuel-efficient, operable by one person, and able to cover ground that 2-man tractor combinations could not match. And then the War Production Board told Massey-Harris they could build 1,100 of them for 1944. Not 5,000, not 3,000. 1,100 total for the entire country to cover a wheat crop that was about to hit 1.128 billion bushels across tens of millions of freshly planted acres. The math didn't work, and everybody in the farm equipment business knew it. What nobody had figured out yet was how to make Washington see it the same way. That fell to one man, and he wasn't going to solve it by asking for more steel. He was going to solve it by changing what the steel was worth. What that man was about to do was either the boldest sales pitch in American agricultural history or a career-ending gamble that would drag Massey-Harris down with him. He was walking into Washington with a contract that put his name and his company's reputation on the line, promising results on paper before a single machine left the factory floor. If the plan worked, it would feed the Allies and prove a new model of farming to the entire industry. If it failed, he would have handed the War Production Board a documented record of exactly how badly he had miscalculated. The War Production Board did not forgive that kind of mistake. Joe Tucker's bureaucratic gamble. Joseph M. Tucker, known as Joe Tucker, was the U.S. Vice President and Sales Manager for Massey-Harris, and he understood something that most people in the farm equipment business hadn't figured out yet. Washington didn't respond to need. Every industry in America had needs in 1944. The War Production Board heard need all day long and turned most of it down, because the military's needs were larger and more immediate and backed by generals with maps. What Washington responded to was math, guarantees, a proposal that arrived not as a request but as a contract, with the numbers already worked out and the accountability already built in. Tucker had spent enough time on wartime advisory boards to know the difference, and in early 1944 he walked into the War Production Board with exactly that kind of proposal. The ask was specific: allocate enough additional steel, rubber, and engines to build 500 Model 21s beyond the 1,100 already approved for the year. In the context of what the military was consuming, 500 combines worth of material was not a large number. What Tucker had to prove was that those 500 machines would do more useful work per pound of rationed steel than almost anything else the board could authorize for civilian use. He built the case around efficiency. A single Model 21, he argued, could harvest more grain per unit of scarce material than any other machine available. It ran one engine where a tractor-pulled combination ran two. It required one operator where the older system required two. It eliminated the grain losses from tractor tire damage when opening fields. Every metric pointed the same direction: more harvest per pound of steel, more harvest per gallon of fuel, more harvest per man. Then he put hard numbers on it. Across the full season, the 500 self-propelled combines operating under the structured Harvest Brigade campaign were later calculated to have saved roughly 333,000 man-hours of labor compared with conventional equipment and older harvesting methods. They would save approximately 500,000 gallons of fuel, and they would recover around 500,000 bushels of grain that would otherwise be crushed under tractor tires during field entry. These weren't estimates pulled from thin air. They came from the Model 21's documented field performance, applied across a planned operating season. But Tucker didn't stop at efficiency numbers. He proposed a guarantee that changed the entire character of the request. These 500 machines would not simply be sold through normal dealer channels to whoever happened to want one. They would only be sold to experienced custom operators who signed a legal contract committing to harvest a minimum of 2,000 acres each during the 1944 season. 1 million acres total, contracted in advance, before a single extra pound of steel left the factory. That contractual structure answered the board's core objection before they could raise it. The War Production Board's job was to make sure rationed materials produced maximum wartime output. Tucker was handing them a written guarantee that 500 combines would cut 1 million acres of wheat the country desperately needed, or the deal was not a deal. He was not asking the government to trust that the machines would be used efficiently. He was promising it, operator by operator, signature by signature. The War Food Administration backed the plan. Their problem was matching record wheat acreage to inadequate harvest capacity, and Tucker was offering a specific, quantified solution to exactly that problem. When it landed on the War Production Board's desk, the board accepted. The extra material was allocated. 500 additional Model 21s would be built, contracted, and deployed as a single organized campaign across the 1944 harvest season. Tucker had come into Washington asking for steel, and he left with something bigger than steel. He left with authorization to run a military-style operation across 1,500 miles of American wheat country, with himself in command. Assembling the Mechanical Army. The authorization came through in early 1944, and Massey-Harris moved fast. The production lines at Rationed and at the Canadian plants shifted to absorb the extra volume, and by late spring, 500 additional Model 21s were rolling off the floor and heading south to staging points at the bottom of the American grain belt, mostly in Texas and Oklahoma, positioned right at the leading edge of where the wheat would ripen first. The machines arrived wagon red, the same deep color Massey-Harris had used for decades. Each one carried a painted sign on its side that read, Massey-Harris Self-Propelled Harvest Brigade. It was unit insignia and brand advertising at the same time, and nobody involved pretended otherwise. Tucker understood that a campaign this visible was also a campaign that would sell combines for a decade after the war ended, if it worked. The men who took delivery of those machines were not company employees. They were independent custom operators, each of them having signed the contract Tucker's plan required. Most were young, mechanically skilled, familiar with field work, and deferred from military service because the government had already decided that keeping certain farm operations running was its own form of war work. They paid $2,500 for their machine, which was real money in 1944, and in return they had something almost no one else in the country had, a guaranteed river of work stretching from the Texas Panhandle all the way to the Canadian prairies, with Massey-Harris scouts running ahead of them lining up fields that needed cutting. $2,500 was not charity, and it was not subsidized. Custom rates ran around $2 to $3 per acre, or roughly 25 cents per bushel. An operator who cut his contracted 2,000 acres at average rates could make his payments on the machine and still walk away with money. The farmers got a fair price. The operators got a business. The government got 1 million acres of wheat cut with rationed materials. Tucker had structured it so everyone's incentives pointed the same direction. The military structure of the campaign was deliberate and explicit, and Tucker made no effort to hide it. The Farm Journal, covering the campaign in May 1944, described it in those terms directly. Operators were lieutenants, Massey-Harris district managers were captains and majors, and Joe Tucker sat at the top as the general. There were even decorations planned, war bonds for the operators who cut the most grain across the season. Tucker was not just borrowing military language for marketing, he was building an actual command hierarchy because the logistics demanded one. Ahead of the combines, a network of company scouts moved through communities along the planned route, talking to farmers, sizing up crop conditions, and lining up harvest commitments before the machines arrived. Behind the main column, trucks carried spare parts and complete replacement engines, positioned to minimize the time any machine sat idle. Field mechanics traveled with the brigade, not waiting at dealerships for combines to be trailered in, but moving to wherever the problem was. And above all of it, Massey-Harris put company airplanes in the air. Those planes served as reconnaissance, flying ahead to assess where the wheat was ripening fastest, reporting conditions back to Tucker's operation, and redirecting combines toward fields that were ready now rather than fields that might be ready next week. It was a primitive system by military standards, but on the civilian wheat belt, it was unlike anything that had existed before. The brigade had eyes in the sky, and those eyes kept 500 machines pointed at ripe grain, instead of sitting at field edges waiting for reports to filter up through dealers and phone calls. With the machines staged, the operators contracted, the scouts positioned, the service trucks loaded, and the airplanes fueled, the Massey-Harris Harvest Brigade was ready. The wheat was already turning gold in Texas. It was time to move. The red tide rolls north. The brigade hit the fields in May 1944. The first cuts came in Texas and in California's Imperial Valley, where flax and early grain crops were already ripe and waiting. A western detachment pushed up through California, taking rice and barley before angling north toward the Pacific Northwest. The main column stayed on the plains, pointed north, moving with the season. The southern plains didn't cooperate at first. Heavy rains rolled across northern Texas and Oklahoma in late May, turning field roads to mud and pushing back the harvest window by days that nobody had to spare. The combine sat at field edges, operators watching the sky, scouts radioing conditions back up the chain, and then operators started confronting the usual mechanical problems that go with hard field work, the kind of issues that, if they ever became widespread, could have sidelined a significant portion of the fleet before it ever reached Kansas. Tucker's service network was about to face its first real test, and whether those service trucks and roving mechanics were worth what he'd promised Washington depended entirely on how fast the network could respond. When the fields finally dried, the brigade moved. 500 wagon-red machines pushed into the standing wheat and didn't slow down. What that looked like on the ground was something most plains farmers had never seen. A threshing ring covered a field over the course of a day or two, A crowd of men and horses and one loud machine working through bundles that had already been cut and shocked and waiting. The Model 21 came in and did the whole thing in a single pass, cutting, threshing, and tanking the grain simultaneously, one operator moving at pace through standing wheat that hadn't been touched since planting. In heavy 30-bushel wheat, the machine averaged roughly 5 acres an hour. A good operator working a long day could clear 100 acres before he shut the engine off. A threshing ring at full strength, working the same field, would still be there tomorrow. The brigade pushed through Kansas in June and into July, following the ripening line as it crept north with the latitude and the heat. Colorado fields, Nebraska. The machines were running hard, and the service network Tucker had built was the reason they kept running. When a bearing went, a truck with parts was already close. When an engine gave out, a replacement engine came to the field, not the other way around. The scouts kept moving ahead, keeping the pipeline of work full, so no operator arrived in a county and had to spend days finding fields to cut. Airplanes watched from above, reporting where the wheat was coming in fastest and steering the column toward the heaviest work. By August, the main force crossed into the Dakotas, where spring wheat farms were large, labor was thin on the ground, and the harvest window was short. This was the kind of country where the brigade's concentrated capacity mattered most. Farms that had been bracing all summer for a harvest they did not have the men to bring in watched a cluster of red machines arrive, work through the wheat, and move on within days. The arithmetic was stark. One Model 21 operator replaced the equivalent of most of a threshing crew, ran less fuel than the tractor and separator combined, and left nothing standing that was supposed to be cut. September brought the end of the route. The brigade crossed into the Canadian prairie wheat fields, 1,500 miles north of where it had started in May. What began in the Texas heat finished in the prairie autumn, 4 months and an entire continent of grain later. The numbers the campaign produced weren't projections or estimates. They were recorded. Across the season, 500 combines cut 1,019,500 acres of grain. They put more than 25 million bushels into the Allied food pipeline. The average per machine came in at about 2,039 acres, just above the 2,000-acre contract minimum every operator had signed before a single tire turned in a field. Tucker had promised Washington 1 million acres. His operators delivered 1 million acres, and then some. The logistics of the harvest war. Those numbers deserve a moment because they're easy to read past. 1,019,500 acres, 25 million bushels, 333,000 man-hours saved. 500,000 gallons of fuel stayed in storage instead of burning through tractor engines running redundant passes across fields the Model 21 covered alone. The 1944 harvest season was already the largest in American history, a 1.128 billion bushel crop that the country desperately needed and was barely equipped to bring in. The brigade's 25 million bushels didn't represent the whole of that harvest. It wasn't supposed to. What it represented was proof that concentrated mobile capacity, properly organized and properly supported, could function as a strategic asset the same way a tank division or a supply convoy did. You didn't win the war with 500 machines, but you proved something with 500 machines that couldn't have been proved any other way. Tucker's core argument to the War Production Board had been about efficiency per unit of rationed material. The season validated it completely. The 500 Model 21s operated with one engine per machine, one operator per machine, and a service infrastructure designed from the ground up to keep each unit in the field rather than sitting idle waiting for parts. Conventional tractor and combine pairs burned 2 engines worth of fuel to do the same work. They needed 2 men. They crushed grain on field entry. They required longer setup times between fields. When you ran the math against the brigade's documented output, the Model 21 won every comparison, and the documented output was hard enough to print in a government report. What the brigade validated finally and decisively was a model of agricultural production that the farm equipment industry had been groping toward for years without anyone fully articulating it. Harvest capacity did not have to be distributed evenly across millions of small operations, each one owning its own underutilized machines and struggling alone through labor shortages and equipment failures. It could be concentrated, mobilized, and moved. The same logic that made a mechanized military division more lethal than a dispersed infantry force applied, it turned out, to bringing in wheat. The 1944 season ended with Tucker's numbers delivered, the War Production Board's investment validated, and something else neither Washington nor Massey-Harris had fully anticipated. The old way of doing the harvest was gone, and the people who had grown up with it could see that clearly now. The brigade had done exactly what it was designed to do. But in solving one problem, it had quietly destroyed something else, something that had nothing to do with bushels or man-hours or gallons of fuel, and the farmers who had cheered those red machines rolling into their fields in May would spend the next decade reckoning with what they'd actually agreed to. The death of the ring. The brigade ended in September 1944, but what it had set in motion did not stop when the last combine crossed back south for the winter. 500 wagon red machines had moved through thousands of farming communities across the entire grain belt, and the farmers who watched them work did not forget what they saw. One man, one machine, 100 acres before dark. That image sat in their heads all winter while they thought about next year's crop and the threshing ring they'd spent decades organizing. Before the war, hiring a crew meant months of coordination. You lined up your neighbors, pooled horses and wagons, fed 15 men at noon and again at supper, and scheduled your days around a shared machine that moved from farm to farm on a fixed rotation. The whole structure existed because no single farmer could afford to own everything the harvest required. The threshing ring wasn't just a convenience. It was an economic necessity built out of mutual dependence. The self-propelled combine dissolved that dependence completely. You didn't need the ring anymore. You needed one man with a contract and a machine that drove itself to your field. The economics that had made community labor essential for generations stopped being true in the span of a single season. The self-propelled machine changed everything. Custom harvesting had existed before 1944, but it was scattered and regional, a niche practice without the infrastructure to make it reliable at scale. The brigade industrialized it. It proved that a professional migration of machines could move north with the ripening line on a fixed schedule, backed by a real support network, and make the math work for everyone involved. By 1947, Kansas alone had more than 8,000 custom combines documented in a single harvest season. The annual run from Texas to Canada, which began as a wartime emergency, became a permanent feature of Plains agriculture. Industrialized was the new word for harvesting. The threshing ring did not vanish the morning the brigade rolled out of Texas. Some communities held onto it into the late 1940s, kept alive by habit and the cost of switching. But it was finished as a system. The long tables of food under the elms, the steam engine at the center of the neighborhood, the rotating cast of uncles and neighbors and hired men working through the heat together, all of it was already a memory. The brigade just made that visible at a scale nobody could argue with. By September 1944, the numbers were undeniable. 500 machines, over 1 million acres, 25 million bushels. The brigade proved that brilliant logistics could do what brute force labor never could at that scale. Compressing decades of mechanical evolution into a single summer, these machines helped bolster the Allied food supply and changed American agriculture permanently. Subscribe if you want more stories about the machines that shaped the world we farm today, and share your own harvest memories below.